Ah, the GameCube controller. The controller humanity's been using since ancient Egyptian times in order to play Super Smash Bros. And that's in spite of all the faults that it has, of which it has quite a few. Now, don't worry, I'm not here to rehash all of the GameCube controller's problems and talk about potentiometer wear and degradation, snapback, stick drift, and all of that stuff, because you've heard it all before, and the good news is that these are solved problems. The FOB GCC, which is an open source hardware project made by members of the Smash community, solves pretty much all of the wear and imprecision issues that regular GameCube controllers have by using Hall effect sensors instead of potentiometers in order to read the stick position, and by allowing the user to carefully fine-tune the controller's behavior by calibrating it just right depending on the individual hardware. The FOB has been revolutionary for veteran Smash players because it is the only controller that doesn't degrade over time or has any kind of wear, at least when it comes to reading your sticks. For melee players, it is by far the best controller to use in order to play the game. But for Ultimate, it's a different story. To understand why, we first have to look at how your inputs are actually being transmitted to the game. You see, there are three components involved in this process. There's your controller, there's your console, and then there's the adapter that connects your controller to the console. Now your input has to make it all the way from your controller through the adapter onto the console until it can be displayed by the game that you're playing. More specifically, in the case of the Nintendo Switch, your GameCube adapter connects to the console using USB. Now, USB is a poled protocol, which means that the host device, which is the console, obtains information from the client device, which is the adapter in this case, by periodically talking to it at regular predefined intervals. Now, these intervals are negotiated between the client and the host. Whenever you plug in a client to a host device, the client advertises itself with a given polling interval that it is comfortable being polled at, and the host then either polls the client at that exact interval or at one that is slightly higher, that is to say at a lower frequency. Now, in the case of the Nintendo Switch, things are a little bit, let's say, special, because even though the USB protocol supports polling intervals of up to 1 millisecond and even lower than that in certain special circumstances, the Nintendo Switch doesn't support anything below 8 milliseconds or 125 Hz if you want to express this as a frequency. Now, when it comes to the game Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the game runs at 60 frames per second or 60 Hz, or it draws one frame every 16.66 milliseconds. Now, if you've been paying attention back in physics, you will already see that there's kind of a problem here. If not, let me break it down for you. In order for your input to be transmitted to the game, it first has to be picked up by one of the console's poles. Now remember, these happen at best 8 milliseconds apart. Afterwards, it has to be picked up by the game during one of its frame capture windows, which happen every 16.66 milliseconds. So in order for your input to be registered, it first has to reach a red bar, and then it will be registered by the next available blue bar. Now in this situation, the orange bars are exactly 100 milliseconds apart, which should translate exactly to 6 frames within the game. However, have a look at this example. Right here, this input is being captured by this pole of the adapter, and it is registered at this frame in the game. Now, if we move 100 milliseconds to the right to the next input, this one gets captured by this pole, which then gets captured by this frame. Now, if we count the frames in between, you will find that we do not count up to 6, but up to 7 instead. Now, have a look at this example. Here, there are actually 5 frames in between your inputs. And just for good measure, here's another last example where there's actually 6 frames in between. So in other words, if you're performing an input that you input as being 6 frames apart, the game has some chance to read it as 5 frames instead, or to read it as 7 frames instead. And from your perspective, this is entirely random. Now the problem here is that the USB protocol doesn't actually support a polling rate that could be a multiple or divisor of the game's frame draw time, because the USB protocol only supports polling intervals that are powers of 2. But what we would need is either something like 16.66, which would be exactly the game's frame draw interval, or 8.33, which would be half a frame, or something else along those lines, which unfortunately is not part of the USB protocol specification. And this, by the way, is only taking into account the path from your adapter to your console. It is not taking account the path from your controller to your adapter. Now this path varies depending on which adapter you're actually using, but for the original GameCube controller adapter made by Nintendo, as far as I'm aware, these poll your controller every 1.2 milliseconds, so this just furthers to increase this window of potential RNG. Then there's also the topic of latency, which is not a huge deal compared to this, because the game already adds 6 frames on top of every input that you perform. But latency in such a system, with polling intervals, is also somewhat random. To be precise, latency for any given input is anywhere between a theoretical 0, which you will never get in real life, but that's the theoretical lower limit, and the sum of all combined polling intervals. So in the case of Super Smash Bros., best case scenario, just going from your adapter to your console, latency would be 0. Worst case scenario, it would be 8 milliseconds. But like I said, the path from your adapter to the console is not the only path that has to be crossed. There's also controller to adapter, which again is 1.2 milliseconds on top of that in the worst case scenario. And then there's also the scan rate of your actual controller, which is how often your controller state is being updated every second. Now for FOB GCCs, specifically for FOB 2.0s, this is 1000 Hz, aka 1 millisecond, so in total you would have, worst case scenario, with an original GameCube adapter, 8 milliseconds plus 1.2 milliseconds plus 1 millisecond plus maybe even a little bit more because of conversions and stuff like that. So how do we actually solve these two problems? Well, the first step, which is kind of a no-brainer, would be to cut out the middleman in form of the adapter and connect your controller directly to the console. This will already improve latency, and it will somewhat reduce the RNG factor on your inputs. So I did just that. I took the FOB GCC's project files, modified them a little bit, got rid of the pins for the GameCube cable, slapped the USB-C connector on it, rewrote the entire firmware in Rust because funny, and called it the NAX GCC. So now we have a controller that has all of the FOB's benefits with Hall effect sensors and all of those good things going on, and it connects directly to the console, which eliminates a source of latency and a source of input inaccuracy. And now that I have a fully programmable controller that I can hook up to my console, I decided that I wanted to test just how bad this input inaccuracy problem actually is if you're connected directly to the console. To do this, I instructed my controller to repeat the pattern of pressing and releasing the up button on the D-pad for 100 milliseconds each, which should equate exactly to 6 frames. Remember the example from before. I then went into Ultimate's training mode, where I have the training mode mod pack installed, which shows me exactly for how many frames the game itself registers a button for being pressed or being let go. I let this test run for 10 minutes, after which I take the footage and put it through a custom Python script that I wrote, which analyzes every 6th frame of the video and uses optical character recognition in order to determine for how many frames the last button state was active for. I then aggregate these numbers in order to determine the probability that your input will be read incorrectly. Now, let me just say, in an ideal world, the inputs should look like this pretty much always. However, since we don't live in an ideal world, but rather a world fueled by misery and pain, every now and then, the USB polling and the game's frame drawing will be offset at just the right or just the wrong interval to produce this abomination. The results after 10 minutes of letting these inputs run through were, well, garbage, to be honest. The inputs were only correct 75% of the time, which means that a computer, a robot, a machine was failing 25% of the time, despite the fact that it was transmitting its inputs perfectly every time. And now remember, this is with the controller connected to the console directly. When you're going through an adapter, the situation is much, much worse. But don't worry, because this problem has now been solved as well. You see, even though the USB protocol only allows polling intervals that are powers of 2, most devices actually have quite a bit of leniency when it comes to waiting for a client device's response. This means that by essentially pretending that we are a quote-unquote laggy GameCube adapter, we can ensure that the controller's state is transmitted to the console every 8.33 milliseconds, which is a divisor of 16.66 and should in theory ensure complete input consistency. I went ahead and repeated the test from before, this time with the controller set to input consistency mode. Again, after 10 minutes of letting this run through, I went ahead and aggregated the results and, well, I think I'll just let them speak for themselves. Yes, your eyes are not damaged. This is a over 98% accuracy rate compared to the 75% that we had before without any trickery. Now do keep in mind that yes, technically the maximum latency is 333 microseconds higher than if you were just to transmit the latest state as soon as you're being pulled by the console, but I think in this case the trade-off is more than worth it in order to ensure that your inputs are actually coming out the way that you want them to. Also keep in mind that even with this quote-unquote extra latency, this is still much faster than going even through an official GameCube adapter, with the added benefits of not having your inputs be messed up. Now, I know what you might be thinking at this point. Whose do I have to in order to get one of these? Now, I know what you might be thinking at this point. What do I have to do in order to get myself one of these? Well, you're gonna like this answer. Both the firmware for the NACS GCC as well as all the necessary files to put the hardware into production are completely free and open source, released today on my personal Git instance and on GitHub. Furthermore, since the NACS GCC is a fork of the FOB GCC, if you already have a FOB 2.0 board, you can turn this into a NACS GCC by simply flashing the firmware on it at no extra cost. The only thing that you would have to do is slightly modify your controller shell in order to allow a USB cable to connect to your FOB board during play, since the GameCube cable won't be used anymore. Now, there's still a lot more stuff to cover about the NACS GCC, such as the improved scan rate of the buttons or the experimental super low latency mode, but these are going to be topics for another video. So if you don't want to miss anything, be sure to subscribe, because during the next few weeks there's going to be a few more bits about the NACS GCC coming up on this channel. In the meantime, you will find all the important links about the NACS GCC software, hardware, and documentation down in the video description below. And that's it from me today, and I hope you have a good one.